Welcome everybody to the online home of the Institute for Sustainable Heritage. My name is Alejandra Albuerne. I'm an associate professor at the Institute and I will be your host for tonight's lecture. We are running one of the Institute for Sustainable Heritage guest lectures tonight, which is part of the ISH Academy range of events that we've started offering a couple of years ago as a platform to engage with industry, academia that is interested in heritage. Before we get started with the lecture itself, I'd like to run through some housekeeping rules. You will notice that your microphones are muted, but we don't want that to mean that you don't communicate with us. We do have a Q&A function that you will find at the bottom of the screen. So, I would like to encourage you all to use it to ask questions to our speaker tonight. If you had any IT issues or any problems with the lecture tonight, please use the chat function for that, and we will try to address that as we go along. So that's it. So tonight's lecture will be about 45 minutes and we will have the last quarter of an hour for Q&A. So please do communicate with us through the Q&A function. So now I am really pleased to introduce to you tonight's speaker, Professor Uta Pottgiesser. Uta is Professor Professor of Building Construction and Materials at Delft School of Architecture and Interior Architecture in Germany, as well as Chair of Heritage and Technology at TU Delft in the Netherlands. Uta Pottgiesser studied architecture at TU Berlin and obtained her PhD in multi-layered glass constructions, energy and construction at TU Dresden. She's a licensed architect and has engaged in the field of construction and conservation of 20th century architecture throughout her career. She is interested in the protection, reuse and conservation of built heritage and environment, and in particular, modern heritage. Since 2016, she serves as Vice Chair of DOCOMOMO Germany and as Chair of the DOCOMOMO International Specialist Committee of Technology. And she is actually the new DOCOMOMO International elected chair, a position that she will take at the start of 2022. She researches, teaches and lectures internationally and is a reviewer for international journals and co-author and author of many publications. Tonight's talk will be on conservation challenges of modern architecture and materials, and it's my pleasure to pass the floor over to Uta. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alejandra, for this introduction, and I'm very happy to be here finally, after we already planned for this lecture more than 1 year ago at the end of February, before Corona and COVID pandemic, but when unfortunately the lecture had to be cancelled. So I'm very glad that now we can do that, though in a different format, and I'm very sorry that I have not had the opportunity so far to visit you as ISH and at UCL personally, but let's hope for times where that will be possible. So thank you so much for this invitation. And as you can see, I will start with a German image, a quite famous picture of the Bauhaus workshop building, where we just had actually our last DOCOMOMO Germany conference 1 month ago, live as a hybrid format, I think, which was very nice. So we could transmit our meeting from the famous aula down in that building. So, but now let me start to talk about conservation challenges. And I had to admit, I had to put this picture here because as you noticed, I think it was just last week when Venice announced to stop the cruise ships to enter the historic city. And when we talk about conservation of materials, not only materials or architecture, built heritage, built environment in general, we have also to talk about the challenges that our heritage is confronted with. And I think this picture is very representative for what actually statistics and literature say, that the heritage threats are not what sometimes we may expect, and most of you will know that actually nowadays tourism is already the second most reported threat after development pressures. And of course, another important aspect are climate change or consequences of climate change and other environmental issues. And so I brought these two pictures, and this of course refers to all kinds of materials and not to modern material and modern heritage in particular. On the other hand, I would like to highlight another aspect, and sorry, there's some German, but I did a short translation on the top of the page, and this rather relates to the, let's say, architectural or the professional environment in general. And this is a quote from a German architectural magazine, which is talking about the current trends and developments in architectural design. And they talk about building, I will read this quote at the beginning: "Building is an environmental sin par excellence. Each new building ecologically seen a disaster. There is no need for more technology in a house, only for more naturalness." And also, again, each new building ecologically seen is a disaster. And this is an architect's magazine. It's not a publication that was brought forward from heritage specialists or heritage authorities. And what we see here is, of course, a trend and a recognition of the professional practice that there is development pressure in some parts, but there is also a very strong trend in the general construction business to deal with existing buildings. And that is reflected here. It is, of course, also this pressure of recognizing the aspects of embedded energy and life cycle assessment within the whole design and construction process. But it's a rather strong argument, nevertheless. Now, moving forward from the general questions of heritage to the specifics of 20th century and of modern architecture. And I guess most of you are familiar with this just newly published book or survey about the 20th century historic thematic framework, which was also presented by Susan MacDonald last week in the ISH conference and was just published, I think, a month ago. And as you can see, that this process, which was a joint initiative of ICOMOS and also of the Getty Conservation Institute and other institutions, was a quite long process to agree and finally to shape this framework. On the left-hand side, you see a report from already 2011. So it was a process then more than 10 years to finally publish this framework, which I think is quite important as it really classifies the building typologies and also the developments that were significant for the 20th century. I just share a few pictures with you, and most of you might be familiar with the publication. So you know they mentioned about, I think, 10 typologies. But these pictures I've brought here are rather expressing the materiality of these buildings, which is quite visible. Of course, the concrete. And they also express, on the other hand, maybe certain formal languages, of course, that come across, and in particular, new building typologies and sizes that might be really different from the centuries before. And it describes, of course, the shift also toward those things. On the left-hand side, these are two pictures from Berlin. On the left-hand side, the famous post-war socialist architects housing in East Berlin that still have this traditional look and materiality, using bricks and natural stone, although as a post-war construction. On the right-hand side, the big industrial development that was so much expressing 20th century, and that describe also in particular this shift in materials. Another photo from Berlin, the famous scientific accelerator for wind and turbines as part of the university and of TU Berlin. That is a complete concrete building, a kind of tunnel, wind tunnel that was built in the 1930s, by the way. Well, as a summary, I think, and in particular referring back to these aspects of what was built and how much built, I would like to bring forward a hypothesis about the approach towards heritage, which means new concepts for heritage are urgently needed. And the main position here is to say, why not 100% heritage as a sufficiency-based concept, which means to consider as an assumption everything as a heritage, and then subtract what might be less significant, which is, of course, a principle, a changing concept that considers heritage also as a resource, rather, and is an expression of the extended framework, value framework and assessment framework that we have encountered also over the last 150 years, that really increases the numbers of values we could also consider for heritage in general. To be discussed later. Now, maybe looking closer at the materiality. Of course, concrete is very dominant, not just because it is one of the most used building materials nowadays, and I guess a lot of publications and on concrete, but also on the conservation of concrete, are making reference to this fact of dominance of concrete. But on the other hand, we have other materials, the one on top, which refer to facades, the Fanella factory and the Pirelli building in Milan, representing steel and aluminium. So the growth of, let's say, curtain wall and glazed facades, which are a big theme and which are one of my topics, rather than the concrete in particular. But we also have other species or sorts of materials now represented by the two lower pictures. A John Lautner from Palm Springs that makes this nice combination of natural, of wood that was also used in a different way than in the centuries before. in post-war periods. And of course, the whole range of synthetic materials here represented by a facade in Brussels from this TV-like design. So, coming back to the statistics, and which is of course something that influences us in the work we are doing when we are developing concepts. While the photos I showed before in my speech, when I showed the typologies of 20th century, rather referred to the new typologies like administration buildings, infrastructure, mobility, bridges, nation building, it is important to say that still the majority of our building stock is made out of housing. And here is one example from Germany, but which counts for many other countries worldwide as well, which shows the development of the construction materials over the 20th century. So just to have a short look at the diagrams, you see here, which is important until World War II, the first diagrams, the shift of materials from brick, which is the middle gray here on the bottom, which was the dominant material, and together with plasters and mortars and fillings. And you see the dark gray, which is representing the concrete or concretes. And you could see that already until World War II, how this amount of concrete was growing and how dominant the construction material became after World War II in the western part, here related to Germany, and in particular in the eastern part. And this becomes even more dominant in the years, in the later years, here until the 1990s. So where then in the eastern parts we know the prefabricated housing buildings where the concrete partition ends up to more than 81%. And we can find similar statistics worldwide, in particular this shift also probably between Western countries and former socialist countries that show this development. And when we look at the share of the building stock, the building stock now here related to Europe, the European building stock, then we can see that the share of buildings, looking at the graphics first, of pre-60s has a share between 10, but mostly between 20 or 30 to more than 40, or even here you can see the UK in this statistic, up to 55%. And now here another statistic referring to the building stock in general, while the other graphics related rather to residential buildings. Then we can see that 77% of the building stock dates from post-1945. Much of it with heritage significance, though not listed monuments. And let me put another aspect into the discussion, that is the famous discussion on the rural-urban shift, on urbanization, on the growth of cities, which is a phenomenon that refers to Europe, but even much more to other continents where the growth and urbanization is much more dramatic. But even looking at Germany or Europe, we can see how drastic actually these differences between densely populated areas are. In Europe, where we kind of see here the areas of the Netherlands, Belgium, but also, of course, the UK, northern Italy, or parts of Poland here, Portugal, even the coast areas, densely populated. And on the other hand, we see areas that are completely lost, or losing population, and have extremely little number of inhabitants. And I'm talking about this because this is also part of conservation of architecture, of the built environment, not primarily the modern architecture in that sense, but we know of how many buildings are left in these regions and are risking to be lost. And we can see the same exposure here dramatically on the German map, where you have the metropolis areas of the bigger cities and the industrially rich southern part of Germany, while you can see that many of the eastern states are really still losing population. We have this to take into account when we're looking at our conservation concepts. And of course, another statistic where I'm not talking, where we'll not be talking so much today, because I'm not looking at the global perspective, but as mentioned, you can see here, I mean, how dramatically the growth of buildings, so the development pressure that was mentioned in my second slide, that the development pressure, how big it is in Asia and in particular in Africa. That means also the pressure to preserve, to conserve the built heritage that is already there. Now, in taking into account the things you have seen, so development of materials, which is the physical side of it, but also the more intangible side of developments, the development pressures, the extreme contrast between urban and rural areas, the specifics of local sites. This brings me to the point to talk about holistic but tailor-made approaches that have to be developed context-specific. And it also means that we rather have to come from, let's say, maybe a traditional view where we rather only looked at building typologies or certain materials that still, of course, build a focus of our conservation strategies. We need rather broader intervention strategies also to heritage. Now, as representing, of course, heritage and technology as a share, it's always a question, what do you consider then as technology? And if I talk about holistic concepts or holistic also intervention strategies, it also means to really come up with a balanced approach that takes different technologies, different building technologies into account, while maybe traditional approaches were rather focusing on the materials authenticity, while nowadays we really have to deal with, in particular, the challenges of the energy transition, of energy efficiency, but also the question of indoor comfort and an approach of passive technologies, which means to rather deal with maybe less building services than we were used to do in the 20th century. So it means our strategies have to take all these aspects into account, which I would say also goes beyond what we are normally educating or training. I mean, we have, of course, conservation specialists which rather come from the natural sciences and materials side. We have architects that rather deal with design questions, and we have the engineering disciplines which then deal with structures and building physics. So that is the challenge of holistic concepts. And having a look at one part that in terms of materials and these holistic concepts, of course, play a role. I was showing this shift, of course, from massive constructions to curtain walls, we also can see this huge diversity that has developed in the 20th century compared to rather maybe slower developments in the centuries before, where we were dealing with, for a long time, with timber and brick constructions. Of course, we have the periods of metal constructions, but just by showing you a few slides here from certain different periods, we can estimate how diverse already the construction of window and steel profiles was. So after industrialization, and in particular in 20th century, you can see how huge and also how diversified the building industry, the construction industry was, and how many typologies of different profiles were developed. This is just a very short glance into some of them. And if you look into books of those periods, the 1920s, 30s, but even in the 50s, you will find much, much more. And of course, that's different from how construction industry has developed after World War II, which shows less diversity and more and bigger companies that produce similar products worldwide. Now, just a short look into what I mean when I talk about holistic approaches and intervention strategies. This was the publication of me and a colleague, Angela Yon from New York, together with Nathaniel Richards, also from New York, that we have published on reglazing modernism, where we finally came back to the three main approaches that are formulated in the US American Ministry of the Interior standards. We know already that terminology is another big issue when we talk about conservation, that many countries, not just English-speaking countries, but many countries deal with different terminology and also different approaches. So here the US American terminology that was used for that publication here. And what we did actually in our publication was looking at significant buildings, all of them listed, many of them even World Heritage sites, and where we tried to make a comparison, where we did a comparison between Europe. We had 11 examples from Europe and 9 examples from the United States, because we felt that the intervention approaches to this modern heritage might be different. And I'm now just looking at 2 of those cases, which is the famous, Viipuri Library here, and the Zollverein coal mine, a German industrial site. More important, as part of our analysis of these cases, was to look into the motivating factors. So all the buildings are described with this kind of chart or table, where we identified the original construction and the different interventions that were made. But what was most interesting for us was actually, of course, what were the motivating factors of intervention. And of course, what we found out is that historic preservation and conservation played a role, and in many of the American cases were maybe rather more dominant than in some of the European cases, or were more dominant, and that in the European cases very often this aspect, of course, of energy conservation was far more developed than in the American. Now, in the American examples, where these aspects of materials decay and preservation were the predominant aspects. And this, of course, results in different solutions for the buildings. So in all cases, of course, where the energy conservation or also user comfort played a role, the interventions were rather larger than than we know it from maybe traditional conservation approaches. Now for the Viipuri Library, the famous Alvar Aalto building in nowadays Russia, originally Finland, it shows two significant elements that we have further investigated, talking about glazing. That is, first of all, these famous skylights that you can see here in this historic picture that gave light into the reading and lecture room. And secondly, on the right hand, this kind of curtain wall of a kind of small double facade compound window with that was shading, giving light into the lobby, the entrance hall, and the staircase area. And here, actually, we discovered two different conservation approaches. On the left-hand side, the famous window wall element here. It's composed of steel frames and oak muntins, and is rather a restoration. It is really the original one, where only parts of the frames have been exchanged, parts of the single glazing has been exchanged, while on the skylights we found a larger interventions. We have to say that the skylights, the historic skylines, were destroyed and were exchanged and had been replaced by plastic cupolas in the meantime, after World War II, and later in the 1960s and 70s. But here you can see the original single glazed layer that was giving, that was a casted, a patterned, a structured glass that was giving a very dispersed light into the reading room, but of course also had big problems in terms of condensation here, and of course of thermal bridges. So the restoration that was led by the colleagues, colleague Tapani Mustonen and also Maja Kaitamo, Leif Eklund, over a very long period, as you can see here, more than 12 years, came up with a solution that really reminds, of course, the historic construction that was not there anymore, and simulates that with a new construction that works with two laminated glazing layers of glazing, in this case now clear glass, not structured glass, patterned glass anymore, and that creates a kind of new cavity and an insulation, a kind of insulation unit, so response to energy requirement, takes care of, or takes in account the acoustical, the building physics, at the same time the safety aspects, and really respects the historic detail. Now, the second case I like to show is the Zeche Zollverein, the famous coal mine building that was the largest coal mine in Europe when it was built in a very short period of only 2 to 3 years, in this very clear, structured steel frame construction with a single brick layer wall and these wired glazings, single glazings that were used to bring light into the industrial construction. What is interesting about this building is that also here the conservation process is ongoing, but already started a long time ago, so more than 20, 30 years ago, and that over time a lot of solutions have been developed. You might be aware that there are famous modifications done by Norman Forster, also by Rem Koolhaas, an extension by Sana, but the architect's office, Böll-Krabel Architects, based in Essen as well, were those who were always the architects that were dealing with the details and took care of the execution of the details. And this is why we find really a large variety of intervention strategies for that building that always take in account that the outer wall construction, the single brick layer wall with the steel profiled single glazed windows is kept, and interventions start with exchanging the glazing. We have parts where the single glazing is kept. We have other parts where the wall is not insulated, the frames are kept, and the single glazing was exchanged by these insulation glass units with a similar, now a wired and patterned glass. And then we have these areas where higher comfort requirements were needed because of permanent use functions as workspaces, restaurant places, for example, where the interventions started to be larger by adding internal insulation systems, a complete insulation glazing, and by keeping the outer wall and adding an inner system. And only in very few parts we have these interventions where a new frame system was adding. So the majority of the historic steel frame construction and window frame constructions were kept, actually. Now, what we are coming back to this question of different aspects of technologies. So the material science, the building services, the construction and structure, but also aspects of comfort next to the building physics aspect. We are also currently dealing with rapid developments related to crafts and new craftsmanship, to new insulation materials, nanotechnologies that also have to be taken into account, or that also influence the way on how we can intervene into the historic constructions, in particular, like, for example, thin and massive glasses that are interesting, also new concrete technologies. And just as maybe as a provocation, or as another aspect, you are probably familiar with this building on the right-hand side. It's the reconstruction of the famous Walter Gropius house in Dessau at the Bauhaus. On the left-hand side, you see the building next to it, a restoration of the original, I think it's the Kandinsky and Klee house, that was renovated and still shows the materiality of 1926, while this reconstruction, which was heavily discussed in Germany, shows the reconstruction of the Walter Gropius house with a new material, actually with a lightweight concrete, and this idea, handmade glazings, which I think is very interesting, and is of course not a house, it's a museum building now and not a residence anymore. So let me come to the last part of my lecture, or also in a way summarizing what I showed before. The question of technology and tradition, which is sometimes seen as a difference, which I say are complementary concepts. I mean, any technology or further technologies have become traditions, but also new technologies. And that is, I think, what is also interesting about 20th century, is that through the rapid development, we are also have changed our perspective on heritage. We are the age is the age factor as a criteria, at least in Europe, is not the dominant one. Our heritage becomes younger and younger. The developments of technologies are more rapid, and they can become a tradition very soon. And in that sense, I also argue that the knowledge is not just the knowledge of the past, and the knowledge transfer rather becomes a knowledge circulation, which also applies to the way of how we apply conservation principles. And as a last part, the question is, of course, how do we learn about these technologies? I mean, how do we train our specialists, not just the craftsmen, also the decision makers, architect, preservation architects? And in that sense, and this has, of course, also to do with, let's say, my role in DOCOMOMO, and maybe my future role and the future role in DOCOMOMO. As you know, DOCOMOMO stands for Documentation and Conservation. And so far, one of the major tasks of DOCOMOMO has been the documentation part, organized by the homework, by documenting the buildings, and of course by describing the building technologies and the history of buildings. Now also the 20th century has been a shift from the analog to the digital world, and we have so many initiatives that are now coming to the front that can be accessed worldwide. And we also approach a new era of how we deal with scientific results. You know about the San Francisco Declaration of Research Assessment and about the open science movement. So this means also we want to make data accessible. We want to be also more inclusive, to give access to people that don't have access to the physical archives. And so DOCOMOMO is, of course, not the only organization who does this. I just put here the logo and the virtual exhibition of DOCOMOMO, because our fiches, so the homework that have been prepared by a lot of people worldwide from the national working chapters, they are still PDFs. They are not accessible so far. And the virtual exhibition is one attempt to make those research work of the past accessible. But we have many more. I just put some of the websites you might be familiar with. SOS Brutalism, which is a website, a German-based website that really reflects nicely on buildings, architecture of the Brutalist period. Another UK site on mainstream modern. A Turkish site which documents very nicely our works that were architecture and design that was built in Turkey, and many, many more. These are maybe just the more common ones. So there is a very rich resource of documentation of material that is available online. And of course, that is the documentation part. What are we doing with the diagnosis and conservation part? In Delft, we have a system that was developed over the last 10 years, which is called MDCS, Monument Diagnosis and Conservation System, which we apply together with our students in Delft when it comes to the conservation, in particular, of bricks and mortars. We are now extending it related to concrete, maybe in the future towards glass and other materials. But what we feel is it's a system that is very good to do a diagnosis and try to come up with a damage assessment. But what we need are, of course, systems that are accessible on site. So we have this little wire here on the right-hand side in Dutch, where people can take it on site to be more precise in their assessments. So to spread the news into the construction companies, but also to architects. But we are waiting for we're looking for rather digital solutions. I allowed myself to take a screenshot from last week's conference and Susan McDonald's presentation. Susan McDonald from the Getty Institute, which are of course at the forefront of really working towards the knowledge dissemination, but also in really moving forward knowledge related to conservation. And I think the slide of Susan summarizes also very interestingly that conservation is just one answer that we have, that reuse and repurpose, recycle and renew are further concepts, and that relates back to this aspect of more holistic approaches. So there's conservation has become a much wider range of how we can approach it. And finally, of course, we have our PhD students. We have knowledge that is gathered on many ways. So these are the current PhD students in my share in Delft. And I think what is interesting that, of course, just to show you, we have a wide range. So we have this work of Amaya, who works on the expansion of mortars related to salt. But then we can see that we have also works that rather deal with the let's say the renew approach of historic sites in Iran and here in Aleppo in Syria, and then further works that deal with the settlements of 20th century and where we ask ourselves on how are the buildings related to healthy environments. And we have works like here in areas like the Arabic Emirates, where the modern heritage only starts in 1979, like with this building, the famous Toyota Tower that is now surrounded by all these new big skyscrapers, but maybe is supposed to become one of the first modern heritage buildings in the Emirates. And of course, the interior reuse of existing office buildings of the 70s. So it's a wide range of conservation, adaptation, and renewal for many more reasons, and that sees heritage as a kind of resource. And I think this is my last slide. I want to share this picture of our DOCOMOMO International Specialist Committee of Technologies, which was our last physical meeting 2019 in Los Angeles on invitation of Susan McDonald. And I really appreciate these colleagues and the community we have in DOCOMOMO and with other organizations to share our knowledge. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Uta. Are you with us? Is the
yes?
Oh yes, I think maybe my connection is not stable in this case. I was saying thank you very much for a fascinating talk, touching on some very relevant topics for, I'm sure for our audience. I can speak on behalf of our faculty members and our students. I'm sure they found it fascinating, and I'm sure external audience have also found it very interesting. And there are a couple of questions already on the chat. We've got over 10 minutes to take questions.
Yeah. Shall I
close
my presentation? Sorry, shall I close my
if you want.
Yeah, it doesn't, because I can't see the questions actually, but okay. Yeah.
You can, if you go to you can, yes, close your presentation if you want. Yeah, if you want to open it again, you can open it again later. Yeah.
Okay.
So there is one question about thermal comfort, which is something that you've mentioned a couple of times throughout the presentation. Yeah, and you've commented on it as one of the motivational parameters for intervention. How do we gather this data, and how thermal comfort is being incorporated in the design of conservation interventions?
Yeah. How do we gather these data? I'm not sure which data exactly are meant in this case. Is it the data of, I don't know, the existing thermal comfort in a building? I guess what maybe is meant in the existing building. And so my answer would be rather general, because the thermal comfort is always an issue, and we know that since Fanger and his diagrams. So there is the measured, the quantitative approach through thermal comfort, which we can of course measure. We have a temperature, we have humidity, but we also have many other aspects of thermal of comfort, of interior comfort, which is the acoustic comfort, which is a visual comfort, which I still think is often underestimated in many approaches, because we rather focus on energy, which means then we focus on thermal comfort but there is an issue that, of course, we have the perceived comfort, which sometimes it's slightly different, which is very much depending on people, is depending on gender, is depending on age, is depending on culture, on that way. So if that was meant with the question in how do we gather these data. So we rather gather these data normally through sensors or through, of course, measurements and something like that. But what we feel, and this is part of the one PhD that I was presenting, the one with the thermographic image, which is on office restoration or on office reuse, where we try also to gather more user data, I mean, so also how do they perceive a specific place, because that might depend on the weather. It might, how are they satisfied with the specific area? So there we combine the measurements through sensors, for example, with interviews and with the kind of feedback system, as you know it from customers' approach, where they say, oh, today I like this place, and then we try to overlay this data. I'm not sure if this answers the question and if this was meant, but then that could be a way of integrating it, for example, also into a design. So we also value the qualitative data that relate, for example, to users next to the quantitative data.
Thank you. Thank you for presenting also the complexity of the problem. So it goes certainly beyond thermal comfort. Then there's a couple of questions about plastics. In one slide, you mentioned the use of biodegradable plastics. How are they applied in conservation interventions?
Well, I think so far, I think they are not so much integrated, I suppose. Because we are just at the beginning, and I may announce that hopefully in the beginning of 2022 we publish then the first DocuMomo journal on plastic buildings, with some contributions actually from the UK. On the Preston bus station and some other plastic buildings. So, I mean, most of these buildings actually are not biodegradable, and they are GFRP, so glass fiber reinforced polyesters mainly, which are not degradable. And the biodegradable materials are quite new materials. And as far as I know from this publication to come next year, the approaches to conserve that are rather traditional in, of course, relayering and redo the layers that were there in the same materiality. So I have not yet an answer to the biodegradable plastics, but what is a kind of vision, of course, that there might be aspects that could be good. I mean, think about window frames, we know that, I mean, windows might be exchanged from time to time, which are approaches of circular economy, so it might be a way that we could recycle elements, and then we maybe find another approach, which is of course different from what normally we have in conservation science, where we try to keep everything that is there. But since we know facades as building services are things that are going to change because the use might change, and that could be an aspect to explicitly use it for certain construction elements. Yeah, that's a general answer.
Thank you. So that's a word for the future, for things to come, applications to come of oh my goodness, that's a word I can't say.
Yes.
Biodegradable plastics. And then my colleague Catherine Karang has another question related to plastics. Do you think there is more need for research into plastics in modern architecture?
Yes, I think. Although I also think that we can learn a lot from the conservation practice in art, yeah, because we know that there is quite some experience related to the restoration or conservation of plastics in art. And there are quite good documentations, and I guess you are familiar with that. So there are the future talks in Munich, and there are a lot of publications that have been done related to that. So there we know about the materials and the degradation, and we also know approaches to conservation. But of course, a building is not an artwork, and a building is often exposed to the outside. Sometimes artworks are too, but that means that the strategies or the techniques we can apply to buildings sometimes may differ from those in artworks. And I think there we need further research. On the other hand, there might be another aspect which we have not so much dived into, but we know that 20th century has also brought forward a lot of new composite materials that are not like pure plastic, but that are combined composite materials. And in that sense, I think this might be a challenge on how to conserve it, if not to replace it, for example. But so far as I know, there is not so much research into these composites, besides the fiber, the GFRP, on the building level. Yeah.
And there is a question about one of your early slides. So how do we introduce more naturalness into architecture?
I think I really like this aspect, and you probably also, there's not only Fridays for Future, but there's also Architects for Future. That's the movement of German architect students that now even try to get into the Union of Architects. I think for new buildings, there is this idea to come back to a more traditional and passive design by using exactly not composite materials, but from this point of view of circular construction, to go back to dismantleable things, and to passive designs, that which means then naturalness in that sense for me means it's a climate-related design, and it's also a culture-related design, which goes back to local materials, which goes back to local climates, which goes back to specific cultural and behaviors and also layouts, for example. And in that sense, when it means how to introduce that into conservation of existing buildings, it might be a point to, most interventions in heritage are unique, so are tailor-made approaches, and we value it. But it could be an idea, in particular when we talk about conservation of modern buildings, where we know that they have been built in a time and they are going to be reduced, so that they will get another function, which also then allows us maybe to do larger interventions due to the function that is needed. It could also be in a way of reintroducing the more naturalness together with these new functions and the redesign of a building. Yeah.
Thank you. That's really interesting, especially for someone who with an interest in traditional construction, to think that there may be a renewed new practice that looks at that. I would enjoy that.
Yeah.
And I think we've got probably time for one final question, and I wanted to ask you, what do you think might be the big challenges for in a few years down the line for conserving today's buildings?
I think it is really what I also mentioned. It's that there are a lot of buildings that need urgent repair and that or improvement or conservation. I think for the concrete, it has become very obvious, that there's a lot of of damages, and due also to, of course, changing climate. And I think what makes, I think it challenges the sheer amount of buildings that would need a treatment, and that we actually have not enough trained architects or conservation specialists, because the conservation specialist is a quite small species compared to architects. And of course, in Delft, we are teaching architects in specific approaches toward heritage, but still they are architects. And normally we know that architects like to build new buildings or like to do maybe bigger interventions. And we have this discussion intensively also among us in our group, in our section of heritage and architecture. So will students be attracted, architect students be attracted, if you tell them to do less intervention? Yes, and maybe to keep as much as is possible. There is, of course, difference between Dutch architects and probably British architects and maybe Italian architects, because it's a cultural thing also. But I think it's really the sheer amount and the need of knowledge, and that is why I also refer to the knowledge circulation, to make this knowledge about the buildings accessible, and to give it, because we cannot do any conservation without understanding the building history, the building, the details. And this means we have to teach to read these buildings and then base our designs on these kind of analysis. And I guess that is a challenge for educators, but also for the professional practice.
Well, thank you to that. That has been a very fascinating talk and set of Q&A. I really want to thank you for joining us today, and a virtual round of applause to you. And thank you all very much for joining us today. And look forward to meeting you in future ISH lectures. Thank you.
Thank
Goodbye.
You. Thank you, Alejandro, for hosting me here, and to all colleagues that maybe were there and students. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
A pleasure.